All right, I think we are at a pretty good number, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining. This is our second webinar as part of our Talking Data webinar series in honor of Data Privacy Week. So we'll be having more conversations over the next couple of days, 30-minute webinars each day, and we'll round the week out with a interactive, fun trivia game show on Friday. So if you head over to StaySafeOnline.org, you can see all of our events that we're holding this week, as well as sign up to be a champion and receive all of our resources from the National Cybersecurity Alliance in honor of Data Privacy Week. So today's webinar is Privacy and AI. Just a quick note, this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube and our website by tomorrow morning. So please feel free to leave any questions in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to it at the end of the webinar. And I will go ahead and kick it off to our speakers, Joe Jones, Research Director at the IAPP, and Brandon Pugh, Director of Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats at the R Street Institute.
Thank you so much, Lucas, and welcome everyone who's watching us live. Yeah, it's a pleasure and privilege to have this discussion, to be in discussion with a good friend, an expert thought leader and doer on these issues, Brandon, who is the Director of Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats Policy at the R Street Institute. And not for nothing, he's a member of the IAPP Research Advisory Board, and at this point, I think an honorary consul for the IAPP. So welcome, Brandon. It's a pleasure to be with you today on International Data Privacy Day.
No, Joe, you're way too kind. Yeah, no, I really think so highly of IAPP, and thrilled that you put up with me. I guess it's really you putting up with me on the research advisory board because I seem to bother you about things all the time.
Not at all. Look, hive mind, and on that note, I do want to make sure that everyone who is listening live, you do engage with the chat function, the Q&A function. Please do share your questions, your thoughts, your comments, and your predictions. We're gonna reflect on where we've got to on a lot of the privacy and AI governance issues to date, and we're also going to reflect on where we think we might be going in the future and what it means for the governance of these issues, the safety and security of these issues, and what we think some of the big developments coming down the line might be. And there are a lot of big things happening in this space at a geopolitical level, at a technological, societal level, that this is a field of issues that is just frantically moving. It's diverse, it's vibrant, it's varied, it's incredibly important and incredibly challenging. So with that, Brandon, I really just want to ask you first of all, just to share some of your high-level reflections on what today, International Data Privacy Day, means for you personally, professionally, and for your work on these issues at the R Street Institute.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joe. And thanks to NCA for hosting this. Yeah, for those that are not familiar, people are probably like, what is this R Street? What is R Street Institute? So we're a think tank in DC. So essentially we conduct research and, provide recommendations to policymakers, whether that be members of Congress, the administration, federal agencies. My team specifically looks at data privacy, cybersecurity, and then AI as it touches on both of them, which, as we'll get to, is seemingly, more and more these days, it's hard to actually draw a distinction. So yeah, I actually am a huge fan of Data Privacy Day and even what's become Data Privacy Week. I know some question like with the value. I actually think it has a ton of value. I mean, it's hard to believe, but I'm just an attorney, so math isn't my strong point. But I think this is like the 18th year, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously, Europe beat us to it. But one of the essential tenets of why it was created was to generate awareness around data privacy, specifically for consumers. It's so easy to operate in a bubble in Washington, D.C. and be thinking about policy, or for those that are working for a company to be thinking about, corporate policies. But at the end of the day, there was a huge role for the individual to be mindful of their own personal privacy. And despite anything a policymaker does or a company does, there's still an individual role. And I realize most people aren't going to read every privacy policy that is presented to them. But, hopefully this day and this week will at least make you think twice, like, should I share this data? Or should I be a little more concerned around how it's being secured? Even if you do it one or two more times, that's a success.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm going to add to that, and your point around raising awareness within organizations on the importance of these issues. The privacy peaks and troughs in the minds of and in the consciousness of business leaders, in the minds of politicians, And I think having a moment where the profession and the professionals can bump up the importance, the prominence, the consequences of privacy and data protection issues is really important. This year's theme, because of course it wouldn't be a day without a theme, is putting privacy first. And I think that's a really interesting theme because one of the things we see, and I see it from the position I'm in at the IPP, but we hear it from so many leaders. I know, Brandon, you've talked about this as well, is just the role of privacy in how it intersects with, overlaps with, maybe even is in tension with other digital laws and policies, new technologies, and how do we manage that? How do we grapple with all of that? And we're really focus in for a moment on AI. And of course, we had the chat GPT effect where everyone's talking about AI, everyone's talking about how to utilize it, how to govern it. And Brandon, this has become and has been a big part of your work. Can you share with us like how AI governance is featured in your work and how it's related to your privacy work, your cybersecurity work, those overlaps, intersections, and tensions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I have to flag obviously IAPP's work too, which you know better than me, really around digital governance and really getting at the point that these aren't separate roles anymore in a company. It's not like you're the chief privacy officer, don't talk to legal, or you're the chief privacy officer, that's distinct from the chief AI officer. Even if they may be technically different titles and different individuals, in reality, hopefully you're all working together on a pretty routine basis. Um, and I think it gets to a broader point. Historically, there has been some degree of overlap between these different jobs or how they're structured in companies, but AI has really accelerated that. AI has really forced these individuals in these roles to come to the table. As novel legal questions come up, having to work with your chief privacy officer or your chief AI officer if you have one. Same thing on the security front. I will say, obviously this is an AI focused event. I always do like to remind myself, AI, obviously it's newish and it's in a front of mind for many people, but it is ultimately one form of technology. So I hope like these trends and these conversations continue regardless of what the future tech is or even apart from AI. But specifically to your point, there is a ton that's blending over. It's really impossible to discuss AI without discussing privacy. Um, because obviously I can't profess to be a technical expert per se in AI, although the amount I read on it seems like I've become one. But AI at its core is all around data. And obviously a lot of questions come up with that. How are we collecting data? How is it being leveraged? Who is it being transferred with? All those same questions apply in AI. Um, but on the flip side, AI needs data. So you don't want to take an action that unduly limits the data that it can be, leveraged or trained from. So it really is striking that balance between privacy, but still allowing innovation. I get that's hard to sometimes do in practice, but that's something policymakers at the state, federal, and even international level need to grapple with. And there's been, some solutions, but maybe not 100%.
Yeah, I love that. I think that speaks a lot to the push-pull factors with privacy. My own perception on and being very reflective on International Privacy Day is privacy is sometimes at risk of being mischaracterized as a slowing or knowing function. Right? It's a function of no, a department of no or go slow. And that's a really challenging philosophy to hold in an era that, as you say, politicians and regulators and industry want to move, right? They want to innovate. They want competitive, comparative advantage. They want the latest innovation. And I actually think there's a really important role that privacy professionals can play in making sure and pivoting their work to be about, yes, safety, responsibility, good governance, that actually encourages innovation and responsible innovation. Good innovation is really in large part due to good governance, and privacy professionals will take on new roles and new purpose, I think, in this space. And I love what you're talking about in terms of the overlaps. There's a lot of good reason and logic why privacy overlaps with AI governance, and we see that crudely, lots of the job titles we see have changed, right? You look in the market, all these chief privacy officers have become chief privacy and AI governance officers and something else, if you've got a privacy impact assessment, you're probably leveraging that to some degree for any AI impact assessments that you're required to do or your organization wants to do. But there is new, right? And as you say, there's a lot of new and unique to any technological application, any context. And I think there's a lot of humility that our industry is practicing in learning, upskilling on the extra areas that intersect and overlap and conflict. And that brings me on to another theme, which is safety and security. And we've often for some time seen how these issues are so integral to good privacy and data protection. Sometimes safety, especially public safety, can be seen as in conflict or in tension with privacy concerns. And so, Brandon, walk us through how you approach some of these big conceptual discussions and debates and how you see it playing out more specifically with AI. How are we seeing the safety and security discussions shape AI governance?
Yeah, no, it's really hard to have a conversation with AI without getting at safety and security. I will say we probably split our time between privacy and cyber now. And about 18 months ago or so, we actually created an AI cybersecurity working group purely to look at what are the security concerns that AI presents. So on one hand, how do we protect the infrastructure of the technology itself? How do we prevent perhaps malicious use of the technology? But then equally as important, if not more important, how do we leverage the technology for good in the security space, realizing bad actors are always going to try to exploit the technology, no matter what we do from a policy or corporate, angle. But can we utilize the technology to combat some of that? And we've seen like awesome innovation in that space. So that's been something my team and I have really engaged on and tried to create a niche on in the corporate and policy world. I will say, like, we have seen the concerns evolve. When generative AI really rose in prominence, I guess almost 3 years ago at this point, there were these widespread concerns that AI would largely shut down critical infrastructure. It would lead to perhaps the start of new wars or conflicts. And I don't want to diminish, perhaps something like that could happen in the future. We just largely have not seen that yet. What we have seen, though, is AI being leveraged by bad actors to amplify and make traditional threats easier and quicker. I mean, to give one concrete example, and anybody listening from a company, you've probably went through a million phishing awareness videos where there's no disputing that AI has enabled phishing to be slightly easier. It's being more realistic and it's significantly quicker. So that is a concern. But the flip side of that is we have seen AI being leveraged to prevent phishing, better detect it, and we've even now seen the innovation really take 10 steps forward, I would say. And what I mean by that is allowing autonomous responses. So if a system detects that it could be a malicious cyber incident, being able to take certain actions without a human even being involved. Not saying there's not a role for a human, but to try to close that gap of what may actually be a delay and a malicious actor to have a step ahead of a defender in cyberspace. So those are types of things I'm really encouraged by. And I think it's fair to take a healthy, look in both. Like, how do we prevent misuse? But then equally as important, how do we allow for this, innovation in the security side?
So fascinating and really complex. And actually, I want to piggyback onto that, a question from Taylor Woods. Really, and I think Taylor's question is really striking at, we've spoken about all these intersections and this complexity across the laws and the policies, but there's also complexity within organizations. There are different teams, different functions, different accountability lines. Then there's different platforms, different systems, different use cases of the technologies. How do you try and cohere and bring some sense and order to all of that? And I'll just share some brief remarks and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Brandon. But this is really hard. I actually think this is one of the top challenges for many organizations right now. How do you bring together all these different disciplines that are out there, and then how do you make sense of it all internally? I think some of that is language, and I don't mean that literally, but I mean that in the sort of softer way, that lawyers speak a different language to engineers, to public policy, to comms, to the business product lines, and finding ways that you can all get at the same thing. So that's one. And then I think clear lines of accountability and governance. We did some research last year that looked at org charts. Not a super exciting thing to look at, different organizational charts. But that is what gives companies life. That's what means companies can report, give information to the board, drives decision making. And so it's so important to think through how teams are structured and how they're governed and how they can report to working out some of this. But Brandon, would love to hear your thoughts on how you're seeing some companies and organizations work through these different domains.
No, I actually, truly agree with you. I mean, one thing I would add to that is, I guess we see different levels of adoption within companies. At first we saw many companies that were skeptical and perhaps wouldn't allow it because of perceived risk. We did, but then at the same time, we did see others really jumping into the technology and fully embracing it. In reality, I think it's probably, in my personal opinion, good to be in the middle. It's good to have conversations in advance. Talk through potential risks, talk through potential legal and security concerns, but then also collectively think of ways to mitigate those concerns. That way you can leverage the technology in a smart way. And I think that sometimes people miss that step. I know it can seem, cumbersome to say, let's generate policies and have internal frameworks. And largely, they should be specific to your company. Not saying you shouldn't start with a framework, and many good ones exist out there, but do actually like make it applicable to your company. That way, it's just not a stock policy. Think through the types of data, think through the applications you envision, and do you have any unique considerations? Are you using it in an area that is, classified perhaps for anybody from government listening? Are you at a law firm with client information? Those are all unique considerations that make it essential to have these conversations up front, but not shy away from the technology. I will say, I think at some point, if you're not leveraging the technology, you probably will fall behind, either peers at other organizations, or in my context, I come from a national security background, will certainly fall behind adversaries in a nation state level.
Let's actually touch on, well, let's do more than touch on it. Let's talk about it because we've had some questions here that, of course, reference and speak to developments that are in the news the past few days with DeepSeek. But I'm going to take us a level up, actually, and let's talk about, and it's fitting on International Data Privacy Day, the global considerations. And again, my perception is our issues, whereas traditionally, historically, could have been regarded as very regulatory, very technical, sort of backwater that's not very noisy or elevated. That's very different today. It has been for a few years now. These are issues of high politics, high geopolitics. They strike at a nation's competitiveness, a nation's security. We've seen this in the report of Mario Draghi about the EU. We see this in the new administration in the United States. These are matters that are really important and on the desks of the state. And so it'd be good to get your thoughts, Brandon, what you think about when it comes to the future of the policy making, the practices here, concerning privacy, concerning AI, cybersecurity. What can we expect now that these issues are increasingly seen through the prism of more hawkish policies on security and foreign policy?
Yeah, no, a great question. Admittedly, I tend to follow what the U.S. is doing most, and if you haven't been following, there's been significant developments over the past week, and I think many more significant developments to come. I will say before I kind of dive into those, one thing I always like to say, especially in a national security context, regardless of what we do from a U.S. policy and legal standpoint, adversaries and bad actors largely are not going to respect that. And I'm not saying that means we do nothing. We have no frameworks or laws in the US. We certainly should. But it is going back to that balance of not hamstringing valid uses in the US. Meanwhile, other countries, what we may not agree with or have the same values as us, are really operating in a wild west and are able to surpass us. And unfortunately, we have seen that happen in other types of technology. And I'd hate to see that repeat itself when it comes to AI. And the U.S. has largely been a little behind on some of these, policy and legal questions. I mean, the EU AI Act has been out there, and I know not every U.S. policymaker may agree with that approach. So maybe it's helpful just to take inventory of what's happened in the last week. And I say all that to say is there is open questions. So, the Biden administration did release an executive order, and depending on who you asked, it was either the longest or the second longest executive order in U.S. history. And there was a perception by notably many Republicans that it was very burdensome. It deferred too much to the federal government and perhaps could have hamstrung innovation and valid uses. So there was no surprise when the new administration started that that was immediately rescinded on day one. In fact, they actually promised that that was going to happen. So that has been rescinded. Um, what we now have in its place is an executive order came out about 2 days after that, basically saying we're going to take an inventory of everything our federal agencies have been doing and see if it aligns with the future direction of where the administration wants to go. If it doesn't, perhaps we pause or even end it. If it does, perhaps we continue it or even double down on it. And I would say it. I usually don't read things word for word, but it's only a sentence. I think this summarizes where the new administration is and their policy. And it basically says it's the policy of the United States to sustain and enhance America's global AI dominance in order to promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security. And the reason I share that is really the stand they're going to be leveraging to go through and look at agency-specific action AI. If it does not meet that standard, there's a potential risk that won't continue. So I will say, obviously, AI governance was very much a priority for the Trump administration in 2019 and 2020. They did release executive orders, and many of those individuals who led that have actually returned to the administration. So there actually will be a degree of, I think, stability, although there will be a lot of changes from what we've had the last 4 years. And you may agree or disagree with that approach. I just think we'll be taking an approach that errs on the side of innovation and less bureaucracy versus perhaps leaning on an approach that is very cautious and may slow down progress.
Yeah, and of course, and forgive me if it states the obvious, but whatever actions are taken with respect to executive agencies and federal agencies does have such an impact for the private sector as well, not just the private sector that are working with or contracted with the public sector, but it just has that trickle out effect. And so it's really worth, if you're a private sector company that has no interaction with federal agencies, it's still worth paying close attention to what's happening here. And of course, if you have a global footprint, US leadership on these issues does matter, and it does spread, and it informs the views of others. I'm going to say that I actually think this year we'll see a lot of reckoning in parts of the world as to whether their approach has struck the right balance between sort of safety, governance, responsibility, and innovation. And I think the EU is one place where I think we'll see quite a vibrant discussion of that, where there are many powerful voices that think the EU is falling behind on the innovation side compared to the US. Of course, we have a different approach in China, and I think we'll see this debate get quite vibrant over the coming weeks.
I think you're right. And it's good, it's good to keep in mind that ultimately the White House is only one actor in this space. So even at the US level, we can't forget about what our state governments are doing because, just like privacy, in a way, we're actually repeating it. In the absence of congressional action, many states have picked up this issue and have run with it and made state level laws, which sometimes can be a challenge because if you operate in multiple states, just like privacy, you are following different conflicting approaches. Sometimes there's overlap. And then I also wouldn't rule out potential action from Congress. I will say my, assessment of Congress is there's less interest in doing a comprehensive AI measure like what we saw in the European Union, and more interest in saying if there is a specific area where existing law and regulation doesn't address and there's a harm or potential risk there, maybe that's an area we consider action, but it'd be very tailored. And I think that's actually probably fairly aligned with where the White House is. I will be curious though on how other parts of the world respond. And we've seen some initial thoughts on that, especially given the Trump administration's changes in AI. I think there's some calls to say, well, let's revisit what we have now so we're not an outlier. And from a competitive standpoint, we want people to buy from us and not from the US necessarily. So there isn't some interest in making sure your policy aligns.
Yeah, and it's a good flag on just the complexity of the US landscape that yes, we can sometimes look at the executive orders and what's happening on the Hill in DC that is federal. Meanwhile, we're seeing a lot of activity at a state level. There are 400 AI bills in the states last year. There are 20 comprehensive privacy laws that have been enacted and are enforced at a state level. 50 data breach laws across the United States. So there's a lot there. And I think, we often hear that there are so many countries in the world with the GDPR type law, and the US is not one. I think that mischaracterizes the nature of the privacy landscape in the United States, which is really complex. States, sectors as well, mixture of federal laws woven into that too, and self-certification standards. So it's a really complex dynamic space. We're getting loads of questions. It's amazing, loads of feedback, lots of projections and predictions as well. I'm also mindful of time, so I do really want to come back to this theme of it's all getting increasingly complex. The role of privacy is so interwoven with cybersecurity, with AI governance. We've not even talked about the other issues, intellectual property, content moderation, online safety, accessibility. There's just so much related to the regulation of digital technologies and the governance of that. What's your sort of parting messages for organizations on how to do this successfully? And maybe let's get specific. How do you responsibly engage with AI? How can you utilize AI responsibly best if you're in an organization?
Yeah, I will say just a high level thought and then maybe give you a little more specificity. I personally, I'm an optimist when it comes to the technology, and I realize not all would agree with that sentiment. So I say, like, do not shy away from it. The technology is not going away. Matter of fact, we see the opposite. Whether it's a US model or, in the case of many questions, a new, Chinese model and company, they're only improving. So I think the applications and uses for AI are only going to expand. So I think taking a view that we're not going to engage with the technology or not consider it, I think it's going to be outdated very quickly if it's not already. So I would really lean into the beneficial aspects, especially, seeing how it can actually make, and this is very like use case specific. So looking at what industry you operate in, what customers you have, or if you're in the government, it's a little different. And then be thinking through how you can actually leverage it. And it's not a one size fits all approach. I will say, some people have my belief, a wrong view of AI. It's not the magic solution. It shouldn't, fully take over the role of a human. I think it can supplement a human. And perhaps one day this calculus will be a little different, but at least now, especially from security, it can help us a lot in defending companies. But it doesn't take away the need of a human cyber defender. Like that still exists. So that's one thought. The second is, I think it's important to have these tough conversations, and you shouldn't at all levels of the company. And I think it's appropriate to be involving your board, and have them involved in this risk calculus and seeing what their appetite is for some of these use cases and innovations. That way, it's not just a lower level conversation. Just like we're trying to bring cyber to the boardroom, I think AI should be brought to the boardroom as well. And then third, I'd be really following what federal agencies are doing. To Joe's point, like the executive order was largely in relation to how public sector entities can leverage AI. I do think we will see some new guidance and readjusted guidance coming from the U.S. federal government, and that could have implications for some listeners. So, for instance, if the Federal Trade Commission is looking to do something in privacy or AI, many of you would be potentially impacted by that. So, I would be paying attention to some of those occurrences, and I do think we'll see some more over the next 175 days, given that's the timeline. We have 180 days for the president's new executive order.
Amazing. That is so helpful, so impactful. So look, let me conclude first of all with a huge thanks to you, Brandon, and to our really active live audience. Thank you so much. We've got a lot of challenging but incredibly important and incredibly rewarding work to do. I often remark that the profession of privacy itself came from people in lots of different disciplines and backgrounds: law, compliance, different domains, intellectual property, tech more generally. And here we are again at a moment where we see the issues intersect with, combine, even clash with others. And having a sort of hand in glove approach to this, making sure that, as you just said, you can report up to the board to empower decision making, to empower good governance and structure. That's going to be one of the key ways to make better use of these technologies in ways that are safe, trusted, but also effective and innovative. So with that, a huge thank you again, Brandon. This has been great fun. It's been great fun interacting with our live audience as well. So thank you so much, and a happy International Data Privacy Day wherever you are.
Yeah, and you as well, Joe. I really appreciate you doing this as well as to your daily work at IPP.
Likewise. Thank you. Lucas,
All
back to you.
right. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Brandon and Joe, for participating today. As I mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded, so it will be available on our website by tomorrow morning. And I hope to see you all for the rest of our Data Privacy Week events this week.